So let's get started. I'd like to welcome everybody here to today's talk. My name is Gordon Hull. I'm the director of the Center for Professional Applied Ethics here at UNC Charlotte and a professor in the philosophy department. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to say a little bit about the series that the talk is a part of. It's called Stories for Survivability. It's about disability and ethics, sort of broadly conceived. And Ashley will be the third speaker in this series. The first two were Rosemary Garland Thompson last fall and Joel Michael Reynolds a couple of weeks ago. If you missed those talks, both of those are available on the center's YouTube channel. To find that, you can go to the center's webpage, which is ethics.uncc.edu, and there's a little YouTube logo up on the upper right-hand part of the screen. There will be one more talk in this series after today. Kim Q. Hall of App State will be giving a talk on April the 15th at 1 o'clock. You can register for that the same way you did for this one. There's the link on the center's webpage, and I'd certainly like to invite you to that. I should also tell you the center's been running a series on models for equitable minority inclusion in institutional research, sort of a citizen science oriented series. We've had several speakers on that one. One more of them coming up on March 22nd, Max Lieberone at the University of Newfoundland will be doing a talk called Colonialism and Citizen Science. And again, you can register for that one on the center's webpage, and I'd love to see everybody there. So today's talk is by Ashley Shew. She's an assistant professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech University. And she will be giving a talk today on narrative against, I'm going to let her do the title because I can't see it on my screen, so I can't say it right. So let me just welcome Ashley and give her the floor.
Thank you so much, Gordon, and thank you for hosting me. I'm going to do the most scary part of any Zoom, and that's try to share my screen with a group of people watching me do it. And the UPS man just arrived, so obviously perfect timing there. So here we are. I've put in the chat a link to my slides if you prefer to follow along that way. I'll be displaying them, but sometimes people go too fast or too slow through things, and it has lots of quotes and things in that way. I can't see the chat while I have this up very easily, so if you have a question for me, please do unmute, or if someone types something into the chat, Gordon, if you could pick it up and let me know. I'm happy to pause and answer questions. I get off on tangents quite often, and I don't find that unproductive. So yeah, I would love to be on a tangent. So let me hit present mode. Here we go. I don't think I've lost you yet. Yay. My title is Narratives Against Ableist Technology. And as I was working on this, I started to think about like the opposite of this talk, which would be technology against ableist narratives. And that would be a presentation about like the spikes that you can put on your wheelchair's handles so that people can't, move you in your wheelchair and things like that. That's not this talk today, although certainly something I'm interested in. So thank you for having me. My name is Ashley Shew. I am being zoomed to you from the traditional lands of the Tulalore Monacan people, a land that was granted without permission to Virginia Tech. And from my home, you can see a Princess Castle tent behind me on the outskirts of Blacksburg, Virginia, here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I'm grateful to be with you in this form and format. I welcome interruptions. My talk is about developing narratives against ableist technologies. And what does that mean? I want to speak to you about the stories that are tropes out there, the backdrop against which many disabled people exist. And then I want to talk about how to design and build and work against those narratives. My specific interest is about how disability technologies, the way we talk about them generally differs from how disabled people talk about those technologies. So I want to talk back against dominant approaches and tropes that exist that I'll be telling you about today. There we go. So this work is supported in part by a National Science Foundation Career Award, number 1750260, but the opinions here do not represent the National Science Foundation. They like for me to say this, but this means that I have funding for what's growing to be a fairly large group of students. Some of them have graduated and rotated out, but I have undergraduate students, Kelly Dunlap, Stephanie Arnold, Adrian Ridings, Jack Cummings, Kelsey McGregor, and currently Hannah Jane Upson, who have contributed to some of this research, and graduate students Damian Williams and Kolyash Sumidalova. And especially for this talk, I'm drawing upon the work of Hannah Hertigan. Especially at the end, I will just directly be quoting from some of Hannah Hertigan's work that she has done as part of this grant. I want to start with an anecdote. I was lucky at my first disability studies meeting to be befriended by another amputee. Her name is Mallory K. Nelson. Together, we hit up other meetings. So we've gone to a couple Amputee Coalition of America national meetings, which are all amputees instead of the crowd you find at a Society for Disability Studies meeting. And at these Amputee Coalition meetings, I'm always struck by what I couldn't have known without community. You end up walking through the conference hotel and looking at everyone to check out which limb they're missing. And it feels weird to see four limbers. For once, they are the ones who are out of place as we commune with one another in hotel bars and patches of carpet in the hotel lobby, in smoking areas, and wherever we can find a place to stretch out. We spread ourselves over a space with various adaptive equipment, wheelchairs, arms, legs, stubbies, crutches, canes, and walkers. There are so many ways to be an amputee and so many tools we can use. My friend Mallory K. Nelson talks about this as being transmobile, that we amputees actually have more choices than non-disabled people when it comes to how we move our bodies. Too often, we're directed to hold on as tightly as possible to normalcy, to normalize our bodies, to use the right technologies, to perform our disabilities correctly, to look people in the eyes even when it pains us, to overcome something, though I'm not always sure what, to be a model for others. And too often, these messages are intensified as we put ourselves under medical and engineering scrutiny, sometimes without wanting to. Many disabled people are approached in public with questions about their bodies. I remember having a really great day one day, and a physical therapist approached me who was not my physical therapist. I did not know them, and they wanted to give me advice on how to walk better. I did not know this person, and frankly, I did not and don't mind my limp. My body wasn't asking for their intervention, just for existing. Other amputees I know are approached in grocery stores to be asked why they aren't wearing their prosthesis if they go unprosthetized that day, or told they are inappropriate when they go without their limb. Others come to believe they are deficient, that they should go out less if they aren't masters of the right technologies, if they don't appear in the way they are supposed to as they meet a public eye, which expects technological redemption of body through technology. So, talking about narratives against ableist technologies is a personal topic for me, but also one that I study as a humanities scholar who works with a group of students and also with scientists and engineers sometimes, and who thinks about the stories we tell ourselves that motivate the projects we engage in. So this slide deck, let's see, has a lot of sections, and I'll probably skim through some of them really quickly. I want to talk, a lot of this talk will be background. We need to know the context in order to be socially responsible, to talk about the ethics of technology, especially when it comes to disabled bodies. We have to know the background against which we're working. We'll talk about the narratives that shape living life as a disabled person and how disabled people from a variety of communities resist current technological solutionism for their bodies and minds. Of course, not all disabled people believe the same things or have the same feelings about anything I will share. And I do say disabled person because I use identity first language. Being disabled is a neutral description of what I am, and a lot shorter than telling you I'm a hard of hearing chemo-brain rotationplasty amputee with tinnitus and Crohn's disease. I also see being disabled as a political identity, one foisted onto how people read me, whether or not I agree to it. I know a lot of people are taught person first language. People vary in their preferences. And if you want to talk about language, we can later. In the sort of second half of this talk, I'll talk directly to engineers in the room about being ethical. And once I've put you in the dilemma that you may feel once I finish parts A and B, you might be upset with me if I didn't talk about this last part. The final part about counter narratives that I'll be presenting is new material. Its first time being presented in any way and derives from some of the work my students have been doing. So I'll talk about that at that point. So the background, or the stories you've been told about disabled people in disability tech news coverage. We could also talk historical background here, but that's not the direction I've chosen to go at it today. So life as a disabled person is often lived against the backdrop of media tropes. People assume things about you. What people imagine about you is often framed by social, cultural, and religious tropes. These are reflected in media. What people think you need is often framed by these tropes, and the technologies we develop in our society and how we talk about those technologies reflect these stereotypes. I've grouped them into 5 different types of representations of disability. These are not exhaustive. So there are sort of specific representations of different types of disabled people that get played out. So particularly if you are a blind Black man, people are going to assume you are extra musical. That's a particular type of trope and stereotype that people use. It doesn't get quite captured in the media tropes I offer here, but these are more general categories that different types of disability get filtered into, and different people get filtered into as well. The media tropes are pitiable freaks, moochers and fakers, bitter cripples, shameful sinners, and inspirational overcomers. For each one of these tropes, disability is cast as brokenness or aberration. It tells us something is wrong, and disability in all of these cases warrants your scrutiny, dismissal, intervention, or commentary in some way, particularly with that last one. And you see these in all sorts of places. I want to show them to you fairly quick, and this is a slide that's just full of memes. And it's the quickest way for me to just quickly point at these tropes for you. So the first trope of pitiable freaks, in the left-hand corner, there is an image of a young Black man in a white suit, holding the hand of a woman who is using a wheelchair, and the superimposed words like memes and joy is he asked her to prom even in her condition. Like and share equals respect. In this case, we are supposed to feel pity for the disabled person, and then feel that the person who interacts with the disabled person as if they're a normal person is doing something heroic, right? Like and share equals respect. Your respect isn't for her, obviously, it's for the young man in the picture. And rarely, these are circulated every year around prom season, things in this vein. And when you stop and think about what it's like to have your prom date be a pity date, and then it being shared all over the news is actually sort of horrible. I also think here of, I have sort of 2 examples here. The I Am Autism commercial by Autism Speaks. If you haven't listened to it, it came out in 2009. And this commercial has this terrible voiceover of a very scary voice, and it's the voice of autism, and it says, "I am autism, I will destroy your family and your life," and it personifies autism as this terrible force in the world that will break up families and ruin lives, and that's why you need to donate to Autism Speaks. We see pity tropes often played to the effect where people are supposed to donate money to various causes, but it makes the causes more awful in how they depict them, right? This pitiable freaks trope. I think also here, David Perry, last week in The Nation, published an article about having to describe his son with Down syndrome in the worst ways to get support. Right, you have to justify that things are so bad in order to get the basic support from the school system, and how to navigate that, right? These tropes tell us about how to act to get what we need at times, especially when it comes to technologies and therapies that we might desire. So the second trope, and this is This one we encounter often is moochers and fakers, and this is in the bottom right-hand corner here. It is the snarky Wonka meme with the words, "Bless your heart, trying to get disability benefits. I don't think lazy is a disability." And this really speaks to the ways in which disabled people are often policed, that we have to perform our disabilities in a specific way for people to think we deserve the accommodations and the infrastructure that exists in society. We see this all the time in the way things are depicted in various media. Bitter cripples is the third one. I have a picture of Gary Sinise there. You might also think about Captain Hook. These are people in movies and TV who are bitter because they are disabled. And they have some sort of issue with their body that affects their minds in how they deal with people, and they're bitter about being cripples. Shameful sinners is the fourth meme, and here I have this image of a white man holding up a box of Frosted Flakes with marshmallows, and the words on the meme are, "New Frosted Flakes with marshmallows, free diabetes in every box." I think here of the ways in which various disabilities, diabetes, HIV, some cancers are depicted as being the fault of the disabled person. Shameful sinners also plays into when we think about historically how autism has been depicted through the 1980s as the result of refrigerator mothers. So it's not the disabled person who is a shameful sinner, but in fact their mother for not acting appropriately. So the sin might be on the part of the disabled person or on the part of their family, particularly their mother, that comes out with shameful sinners tropes. And once I've described all of these, this last one will seem better than the others, but I think there are reasons we should be wary of it, especially when it comes to technological development. And that is, so this image is of a young girl and a sporty man, both bilateral leg amputees wearing running blades. And it has the quote from Scott Hamilton, "The only disability in life is a bad attitude." And Stella Young talks about this at length in her TED Talk, "I'm Not Your Inspiration, Thank You Very Much." She talks about inspiration porn. Inspiration porn is using brave overcomer, courageous battler praise about disabled people who are doing what society takes as the right way for a disabled person to perform their role as a disabled person. This implies, of course, that to be good disabled people, we have to be fighting against our minds or our bodies in some way. Inspiration porn takes disabled people as objects to inspire others, like we exist in order for other people to be inspired or to feel like their lives are meaningful, valuable, or to appreciate the senses or functions they have. There are a lot of downsides for inspiration porn for disabled people. For instance, it treats us as exceptional individuals rather than as community members of an underrepresented minority who may need access and accommodations. It asks us to live for other people. It works against inclusive design and disability rights. We shouldn't have to be at our best to be allowed to participate. It exceptionalizes rather than normalizes disability as a facet of the human experience, and it exaggerates how different we are. It suggests that we have to do this fighting thing instead of setting up people for adaptation or creativity and thinking about participating in various things. It can also be quite annoying. I've been standing at a grocery store picking out ears of corn, the least inspirational vegetable, and had a stranger approach me to tell me that I'm such an inspiration. Of course, I'm a turd, so I'm like, I'm just picking out corn, and I made it awkward for both of us. We also see these things reflected in media in various ways. So your feel-good news stories don't feel so good once you've started to think about the tropes that the limited ways of being that disabled people can have through these tropes. So a few headlines here are the tech giving people the power to deal with disability, how technology will change the lives of people with disabilities, as if our lives are in desperate need of change. First prosthetic limb designed for women, and I'm going to talk about this one more in a second. And the quote from this that made the headline is, "I feel liberated." And then, of course, robotic exoskeletons are here, and they are changing lives. So when we have these tropes about disability and then go off to design things, imagining bodies and minds, we're still seen as disabled people as fundamentally deficient. Not just people who are looking for some good tools to adapt to a hostile world. So 2 notes here, the stories that disabled people tell about these technologies are actually very different, whether we're talking about the prosthetic limb designed for women, robotic exoskeletons, or any of these examples. And second, most of these stories leave out the context. Prosthetic arms are often adopted because to deal with the staring of other people. Exoskeleton development, excitement, often exists because people realize that the built infrastructure sucks nearly 30 years post ADA. And bodies in all of these cases are taken as problems to solve. And that our goal with technology in all of these stories is to normalize or enhance bodies in ways that suggest efficiency. So my specific work, and I'm working on a book related to this theme, don't ask me how much I've written on it yet, is that we see this idea of techno-ableism in the marketing about disability technologies. Disabled people are told technologies will change our lives, never just incremental improvement. And it's seen in the dearth of stories about disabled designers. So all of these stories are about nice helping people, humanitarians helping those poor disabled people. Disabled people are always seen as these recipients, the helped, but never the helpers. And it's seen in these feel-good news stories about technologies for good. Disabled people are often talked about in these stories without being interviewed. So ableism is this bias against disabled people, and techno-ableism is this particular manifestation. I sometimes call ableism the sauce we're all marinated in, because until you start looking for it, you might not see it. Fiona Kumari Campbell explains ableism is deeply seated at the level of epistemological systems of personhood, power, livability. It's not just a matter of ignorance or negative attitudes. It's a trajectory of perfection, a deep way of thinking about bodies, wholeness, permeability, and how certain clusters of people are enabled via valued entitlements. So techno-ableism is this word I've coined to describe the phenomenon that a lot of disability scholars interested in tech are describing right now. Disabled people are often these objects for design, to be designed around. Techno-ableism covers over disabled voices and elevates non-disabled helpers, because the idea is we need this empowerment, we need this redemption through technology. Techno-ableism involves emotions, attitudes, actions, practices, beliefs, stereotype in the way Michelle Norio-Redman categorizes things in her book, Ableism. And it's set within this context about the power of technology to transform lives, with the idea that disabled is a bad thing to be and that one must be altered to be worthy. The cyborg Jillian Visa writes, "They like us best with bionic arms and legs. They like us deaf with hearing aids, though they prefer cochlear implants. It would be an affront to ask the hearing to learn sign language. Instead, they wish for us to lose our language, abandon our culture, and consider ourselves cured. Like exoskeletons. They like exoskeletons, which none of us use. They would never consider cyborg those of us with pacemakers or on dialysis, those of us kept alive by machines or made ambulatory by wheelchairs, those of us on biologics or antidepressants. They want us shiny and metallic and in their image." So how do we talk back against some of these things? So these are a few select quotes. This section will be sort of sketchy and quick. One way to talk about them is to talk about specific ideas we get from ableism, say that walking is a perfect ideal and that everyone should walk. So Bill Peace, writing on his blog, The Bad Cripple, says, "Your typical bipedal person is exposed to a barrage of misleading news stories and is led to believe all paralyzed people share one goal in life, walking. Please cue the soaring inspirational music accompanied by the brave and noble young man or woman struggling to walk, surrounded by healthcare professionals, computer scientists, and engineers who all share the same ritualized ideal. The flip side of the obsession with walking is not discussed. No one wants to talk about the gritty reality people who cannot walk are forced to navigate, and no one wants to think about the barriers to healthcare and appropriate adaptive technology. disability must be placed in a larger context. And just a sample of what's wrong with exoskeletons, New Mobility, the magazine for active wheelchair users, did a roundup of blogs, one of which, of course, comes from Bill Peace, the Bad Cripple, but they're responding to an exoskeleton's use at the kickoff of the World Cup. And Fred Nicholson says, so, hey, able-bodied media, quit making me feel like wheelchairs are a shitty subpar option. Stop beating the exoskeleton drum. Most of all, let go of your obsession with walking because it's totally overrated. Shane Clifton says, he insults the kick first and then says the device was a monstrosity and I have absolutely no desire to try it. If science wants to help me out, it should concentrate its research on bladder and bowel. You see disabled people talking back to these things. Liz Jackson has used the term disability dongle to describe things that are made by non-disabled designers that imagine what disabled people want and absolutely fail at it, which is a good thing to search. The Twitter hashtag disability dongle will get you there. I also think about the movements around prosthetic hands. I've left this particular link if you want to watch the whole clip, but I want to focus in on this prosthetic limb designed for women. I feel liberated is the quote. I'm not going to play you the clip, but in it, this quote, I feel liberated. And of course, it's a woman, Nikki Ashton, who is using a bionic arm and talking about why she likes it. She had decided for a long time not to wear a prosthetic arm and has started using this one for various tasks. She talks about ways in which it's useful. But this quote, I feel liberated. And of course, this makes the headline. She's talking about riding a bike. The quote, I feel liberated, is about how she can ride her bike with her prosthetic arm. And of course, lots of people get sports arms to ride bikes with. That's not an uncommon sort of prosthetic arm to want or get a sports arm that allows you to ride a bike. And of course, who doesn't feel liberated riding a bike? The fact that they took that as the quote says something about how they want to depict the technology when that's not actually what she's saying about the technology. She's talking about riding a bike and she feels liberated riding a bike. And with the wind through your hair, yes, riding a bike probably does feel liberating, but it's not specifically about the hand. The hand was just one step to doing this other task that was liberating. So the sort of ways in which even when the person who is using the technology, the disabled person, is talking about the technology, like you can see the people who are interviewing her keep wanting her to say like it's life-changing. And she's like, oh, there are lots of little small things that I enjoy doing. It's easier to tie my shoe, but they keep wanting to like push her to say that it's life-changing, that it's liberating, that it's amazing, that it's changing everything for her. And she doesn't say any of those things. She says that it's useful in all sorts of little ways, instead of being this one redemptive technology. But nonetheless, the way they talk about it and the way the designer who was also interviewed, it's a really interesting clip to watch. I'll skip over this particular quote for time, but it's about a mother who has worked really hard to get her 5-year-old to want to use a 5-fingered prosthetic hand. They've been pursuing a 3D printed hand, which you see all over the news. And he's explaining to his mom that he doesn't really want to use the 3D printed hand. And he's wondering if it's okay that he doesn't want to use this hand, because so much of what they've been fed and what they've been taught is that this is necessary, but he's explaining why it's actually, he would prefer not to wear a prosthetic arm. And of course, Rosemary Garland Thompson, in her book, Staring How We Look, has a chapter on hands that is really wonderful. And one of my favorite quotes from this is that the mechanical hand answers the needs of the wearer, whereas the cosmetic hand answers the needs of the starer. It talks about how people wear cosmetic prostheses mainly to get people to stop staring at them or to stop asking about them about their bodies in public. And I don't think this is just about exoskeletons and prosthetic arms, although that's what a lot of my research has concerned in how I'm writing one of the chapters of of the book I'm working on. I think it applies to all sorts of technology for disability. And here I offer Rua Mae Williams, who is working on technologies for autism, and the rhetorics we have around that says technologies for autism are dominated by meta-eugenics via the logics of the interventional. These normalizing technologies seek to correct aberrant behaviors, shape normative social responses, and remediate deficits and delays. This approach seems natural and necessary from the perspective of the helping professions, guided by a conviction that their role is to deliver health and wellness, or restoration or purification via the equation of the norm with health. The logic behind such interventions is that access is conditional upon whether the body is includable or not. Right? This is about making disabled bodies and minds more palatable, more worthy of inclusion. Rua, they finish, the interventional approach is so naturalized that to not intervene is regarded as synonymous with causing harm. J. Preet Verdi, in writing on deafness cures throughout history, says in an interview, the problem with this rhetoric about curing deafness, as we've seen over and over in the history of various hearing technologies, is that it constantly promotes the idea that deafness is something that needs to be fixed, whether through medicine or technology. In all of these, there lies the idea that you have to fix it, have to be cured, rather than just accepting it. And that becomes problematic. I think this does something to you, as it makes deafness constantly stigmatized. It also makes it difficult for deaf and hard of hearing people to advocate for themselves. So it's usually at this point in the talk. So I talk to a lot of scientists and engineers. So I've given you some context for why we might worry about whether disability helping projects might be good projects to do, especially how they're currently conceived. I think there are ways to engage in more socially responsible ways. What we have right now is a lot of social irresponsibility when we talk about disability technology, actually. When it comes to talking about the end of disability, which was a real title of a recent talk at Virginia Tech, obviously not my department, by a non-disabled physician. And he was talking about the end of disability being the goal. But here's the thing. Whether through new diseases or through climate change, or even if we made it there, the ravages of outer space on our bodies, we can expect more people to be disabled in the future. This was true prior to COVID, and perhaps seems even more acutely real too. The one constant we can expect is more disabled people. There may be chronic illnesses and chronic pain conditions and life-shortening situations that we really don't, or that we really do want to cure. But the way we currently think about it, disability is uneliminable unless we aimed for what would be a very limited and homogeneous future, and one that we would probably get to through eugenical means. To more comfortably address disability requires a different mindset than either tropey nonsense or some sort of savior complex that allows non-disabled people to speak over the experiences of the communities they actually want to work for, right? So these are usually the sort of things that I present to engineers and scientists, which some of you may be. And so I have some notes on what not to do. So I have, and this would usually be a longer section for the sorts of audiences I usually see. So a few notes on what not to do. Disability simulation is this practice where people spend a day in a person's shoes, those are the quotes, with activities where they perform tasks blindfolded, quote, to find out what it would be like to be blind, or use a wheelchair to get around, or to use suits that simulate old age, or even using virtual reality to see through another's eyes. These practices were really popularized as disability awareness events for a while, but the outcomes aren't as expected, and the sociological evidence suggests that they're actually kind of a bad idea. So Nario Redman et al. Have published about disability simulations actually leading to negative perceptions about the competence of disabled people. Participants are experiencing what the first day of a newly acquired disability might feel like, and therefore don't get the experience of adapting and learning and coming to see disabled people as competent. In fact, this approach emphasizes deficiency and makes people doubt the competence of disabled people. The outcome of disability simulation isn't as expected. Disability simulations also make non-disabled people think they know what it's like, such that they don't have to interact with disabled people to hear about our experiences in order to design. What is salient in the experience for a non-disabled person, say how hard it is to push a manual wheelchair up a curb cut, might not actually be a focal part of a wheelchair user's existence, especially if they have the right chair for their body and have built up their arm strength over time. And this might be their regular way of getting around. Their disability simulations homogenize the experience of disability. Most of us have more than one or will acquire more sooner as we age. Just using a wheelchair or goggles to simulate blindness might tell you very little about what someone experiences daily or the variety of ways their disabilities impact them. What they take as focal as a concern might not even be the same as someone with the same disability. What else not to do? Don't design for disabilities. This has been sort of a big movement, some key words. But I mean here, don't take disability as the object. You're not designing for disability, you're designing for people. Make sure community members lead or have wide voice in the projects you work on. This is related to don't treat disabled people as objects or problems. Engaging in disability design should be in the framing of Liz Jackson, design with disability, with ideally team members with a relevant disability who are part of the disability communities that matter to the research. And this is where exoskeleton complaints so often arise. So often they're made with military funding, with disability as the humanitarian cover for what is a project related to better military performance in the end, and not really about helping disabled people. That's just the nice news coverage they get. Exoskeletons might be a useful tool for some disabled people. They're always cast against paraplegic bodies in the news when, you know, the most promising use that a lot of people talk about with exoskeletons is actually stroke rehab in physical therapy settings. So it gets advertised differently because, of course, you want the young person surrounded by those physical therapists and computer scientists that Bill Peace describes, and that's not what it looks like when you're talking about a physical therapy clinic and stroke patients. Engineers are often praised for working on disability-related technologies, so it's important to emphasize not reifying paternalistic views that you know what's best, or entering into these environments with a savior complex, that you're there to help save those poor people, re-emphasizing a pity narrative and then putting on a redemptive overlay and then describing those technologized disabled people as inspirational for performing their disabilities in ways that you find palatable by overcoming. I think there are failures of technological and moral imagination that take place here, the first of which is a failure to recognize the structures in which disabled bodies operate. Insurance dominates a lot of our lives, perceptions in the community, social life, finances. When we use techno-ableist frames, we reify tropes about disability. We actually fail to recognize the structures in which disabled people operate. There are a number of great examples. One of them is Dean Kamen's iBot wheelchair that can stand people up and walk up a few stairs. Some wheelchair users loved this technology, but a lack of understanding by the makers of the technology about medical devices meant that they were classified as the wrong type of device, that they were transportation and not like a medical sort of device. And that meant that Medicaid, Medicare, and then private insurance plans would not cover even partially the cost of an iBot, which meant that the iBot was a commercial failure because the people who created it didn't know what it took to get the sort of equipment that disabled people want and use. And you can make all the exciting technology in the world, but very few people may end up with the technology if you don't understand the systems from the community members that have to navigate them. This relates to the second failure. Infrastructure is a part of what we're navigating. An exoskeleton only seems like a necessity when we're not doing basic repairs on infrastructure and upholding a 30-year-old law like the ADA. The perception of a technology can also make it fail. So many technologies aimed at older people, even when they would be useful, have stigma associated with them. I think here of hearing aids and canes and walkers. Hearing aids have a double punch. Insurances won't cover them usually, and they can be costly. And they have some stigma associated with them that you're growing old. We also use less good versions of crutches in the US. We use underarm crutches when forearm crutches are mechanically superior, put less wear and tear on your joints, and are what any crutch-related sport is played on because you can move in much more dynamic ways with them. But the stigma of long-term disability, like with post-polio syndrome and cerebral palsy, rests with the technology, so we don't see it adopted in the wide scale it is in other places, even though they're superior. The third point here that we have is that we have a failure to imagine different ways of being as good or as freeing when it comes to technology. I think of my friend Mallory K. Nelson here, mentioned at the start of this talk, when she expresses all the options we do have. So the sort of radical choice that most people don't have about their lives that many amputees do. And I can think also of the cool and creative design that we see when we see bodies as the site of possibility. I think about tentacle arms and running blades, which aren't supposed to look like meat legs, and other ways around that challenge normalization and celebrate difference and are frankly more fun. So what should we do? And here are the recs I usually give to disability tech folks who may not be part of the disability community. And that involves listening to the disability community, which might seem obvious by now, respect disabled people as experts when you are using their know-how, contextual knowledge, and community knowledge, paying your disabled consultants and collaborators and giving them credit on your publications where it's due is necessary. I, at one point, asked the university architect at Virginia Tech, I was like, has anyone looked at this? Because this curb cut doesn't work. Our campus has lots of places without handrails when it comes to steps. And I was like, has anyone trained an ADA or any disabled person, looked at some of these plans? And of course, the architects say, we're all trained in ADA. You wouldn't know what to look at the place. And then when I pressed a little bit more, the lead architect, who's getting paid buku bucks by the university, has a friend whose son uses a wheelchair, and occasionally he will invite them out to walk around campus with him unpaid. Free consulting about the infrastructure, right? And of course, it's to watch how this person navigates campus as if they can't report their own experiences. This is exploitation. And making sure disabled voices are centered in coverage about any project you're working on when it concerns disability is really important. And then not ignoring the interview subject as part of that, as we saw in the BBC News aforementioned example. There also should be some projects that non-disabled people shouldn't do, or that you should make space to support and advance disabled people in doing. This means, for many people, promoting recruiting and working to retain disabled people in professional groups. This may mean challenging norms in your discipline about what constitutes professionalism, rigor, ideas about time and deadlines, and physical space. I also urge people to use humility, that they don't know what they think they know, rather than empathy, which is how a disability simulation is usually talked about in approaching and engaging disability communities. Empathy, doing how you imagine other people to feel, has gotten the story wrong too often. It fell back into tropes and simulations. I also think that the way systems are rolling out right now with AI, systems that monitor and control people, imagine disabled people as always patients. And of course, patients don't get the same sort of privacy. You can wake them up a million times a night in the hospital. Patients' bodies are open to investigation by people who consider themselves professionals. Being always patients, being imagined that way, especially in machine learning and AI systems, will result in limits and curtails to disabled freedom and interference in our lives. I think about movements around the use of Fitbit data, around leg step counting. So if you have a computerized knee, like the cyborg Jillian Visa, it will count how many steps you take each day. And then your insurance company has that information, and then they can decide whether you deserve particular technologies based on how much you walk each day, right? And I even think about the discussion around monitoring the disabled people's use of social media to see if they should be afforded different governmental benefits, becomes a way to sort and control us, and to reemphasize tropes about pity, but also about moochers and fakers, right? That you don't really deserve these technologies. Listening to disabled, and note, not their parents or their caretakers or other proxy, is really important to doing right by disabled people when it comes to design. So here's the part that the humanists might be interested in. This is where my students have been sorting and making sense of various disability narratives. So we are categorizing and tagging and reading widely disability memoir, disability poetry, disability YouTube channels done by individual disabled people. I don't think anyone's following TikTok yet except me, and I'm not actually processing that. I'm just enjoying it. And people's blogs, and they're categorizing a lot of these things and putting in, writing these things up. So the undergraduates have written up a lot of these things. We have a large computer filed system, and Hannah Hertigan, who's a graduate student who has served for sort of the longest on the project, she's come up with ways of categorizing the counter narratives we find. So how are disabled people actually opposing the sorts of narratives that they're finding out there in the world? And I'm pretty excited to share this with you guys. So one, and this is quoting from things Hannah has written up, because Hannah's done a really wonderful job here, is talking about disabled people as technology users, right? So often, the idea that disabled people should be like gifted these sorts of things. And so this is a counter narrative where disabled people are not passive recipients of technology. They're adaptive, active, diverse user group who face particular restrictions, not because of disability, but because of technologists' failure to accurately imagine their lives and needs. So we think about like hacking different devices to make them work in different ways here. Disability or disabled technology users here often must respond creatively to imperfect and ill-fitting devices, while at the same time resisting ableist narratives. So making something your own. Sometimes this is done, I think about Jay Verdi's work about fancy designed hearing aids where people are like bedazzling them. You're making something fun out of something that isn't as fun. I think about here, the first walker I was given was one of those terrible, ugly hospital walkers, because it's the cheapest thing and insurance will pay for it. I put colorful duct tape all over that thing. We put stickers, happy stickers on it. They often, disabled people are imagined, and the devices we're given are utilitarian and ugly, frankly, and medical. And these are devices we use outside of medical environments. The second counter narrative is technology is freedom, right? So often when people talk about wheelchairs, they use the word confinement, which wheelchairs have wheels. So that's not what wheelchairs do. But Hannah writes, like any other user group, disabled people use technology to navigate the world, to accomplish tasks, and to interact with their environment. Under certain circumstances, disabled people can use technology to provide themselves with certain freedom, the freedom of movement, of expression, of choice, as well as freedom from hunger, from pain and fatigue. So not just life hacks here, but to think about technologies as tools that help disabled people as active users access the things that they want. The third one is resisting technology. And here the phrase piss on pity, which is a rallying cry from the disability rights movement, particularly in the UK. I love the term piss on pity. Hannah writes, it's important to recognize that not all technologies have positive connotations for disabled users. So we think of disabled technologies as, oh, this is like an unfettered good for disabled people. But some of these technologies are thought well, and some of them are not. And disabled people can resist technologies and inaccurate narratives surrounding disability technology use, both individually and collectively. So I think here of people, different videos of hearing aid users and cochlear ear implant users who have found community. There are some videos in this vein of people flushing their hearing aids down the toilet. Right, doing things with their technologies that suggest that they are unhappy with them, or avoiding the technologies altogether. So some of the arm prostheses where users, even though they have access to the technology, in fact, find it superior not to use the technology. I think about this like there is a tax on our bodies to carrying things that are heavy, right? That there's rubbing. I think about, times where my prosthesis has given me blisters, right? Like sometimes I want to say that I should be able to show up in any form I choose, and that I shouldn't have to choose the form that makes people the most comfortable, because it's not always the thing that works. Technological ambiguity, which also is tied to what Josh Earl calls cyborg maintenance, is that things that have that we have positive relationships, and these are Hannah's words, like cell phones or wheelchairs or microwaves, may continue to exist in this positive space in our minds until they start to break down. So we might think a technology is really good until we have to figure out how to replace or fix it. Maintenance around objects for disability is often, the instructions are often very poor. Hannah writes, sometimes it is only when things break down that we begin to notice that they are there in the first place, or to understand how important they are to us. Other times, technological breakdown reveals deeper patterns at work, like systemic discrimination or a lack of resources. If technological breakdown continues to happen on either the level of the individual technology or on the level of technological systems, our relationship with the technology becomes ambiguous here. So it's not clear whether it's good or if it's something we should resist. And the fifth one that we've sort of been grouping these narratives into at this point is about crypt technicians. And this is where we talk about, a lot of things that disabled people like are actually made by other disabled people. Hannah writes, in addition to being users of technology, disabled people are also designers and technicians. This can be because they're employed or trained as an engineer or designer, but this can also be because being disabled means having hands-on experience with the creative use of materials. It means it is often necessary to get creative with things you have in order to make them work. There's this poem from Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasina that talks about building, one of the tiny ramps that's like just over a crevice if a door stop is a door threshold's too high, and about like putting one together with a hot dog. And I always think about that when I think about crypt technicians. Like we've looked at some materials and thought about how to use them in ways that aren't always clear to others or wouldn't be an obvious solution to other people. So that's sort of the end of my slideshow for today. I look forward to your questions. My information, I'm Shew at vt.edu or on Twitter at Ashley Shew, spelled with SHOO at the end. Also, and I'll repost my slides. I have a whole bunch of, if you want further reading in this vein, there are some contemporary threads where I think we're all talking around some of the similar things that we're noticing, and there's different terminology employed by some of these people. And just, yeah, and there's a picture of my dog in space. I'm gonna stop share now so that I can see some of you again. Hi.
Yeah, so let's thank Ashley, and then also invite folks to ask questions. And if you just want to unmute yourself or type in the chat, that's the easiest way to do it. Yes, Andrea.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Shew. That was amazing. I really, really appreciate your work always. And so this was really exciting, and really, I hope, the resources too were fantastic. So I really appreciate the ethos of the talk. So thank you so much. My question is about some of the political dimensions of something like, of what you're describing as techno-ableism. And I heard a few resonances of it in there, but I'd love to hear more. Like when you mentioned the military purposes of exoskeleton research and development, and then the kind of the use of a humanitarian cover for making this as a technology that's now for disabled folks. And so that was one instance, but then I also thought too about potentially some biochemical adaptive technologies and things like that as they're being used in different carceral technologies and things like that. So I wondered whether there's also ways of thinking about the political carceral dimensions of techno-ableism and how that might work in the way that you're describing some of these technologies.
Yeah, so I think about how people, I worry a lot about the monitoring of disabled people, because I see this as it's always been a problem, right? Because people think we're moochers and fakers. The obvious solution is to monitor us and go, when most of us experience our disability in wonky ways, right? That we have good days and we have bad days. And the things I might be able to do on my good day is not the things I can do on my bad day, but my good days are used against me. I see this talked about in a lot of disability communities. In terms of the carceral end here, I think about, there are some really interesting things going on with the disability justice movement out of San Francisco, sort of the work of Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, some of these people who are articulating how ableism is used against people in all sorts of ways. So you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. And then, of course, a lot of the ways we monitor and track disabled people, people who don't fit into that model or are treated as non-disabled in ways, they might actually be disabled and have accommodation needs, and the ways in which we make people certify themselves as disabled is really problematic. I don't know if I've lost the thread of what you're talking about here. I'm really excited about what's going on in disability justice, putting it in tune with a lot of the technological conversation. I think about who gets to have the technology, and sort of the default of like what data we're filling in. I think about how prison populations are used to study things like facial recognition in ways that are definitely going to be bad, and no one should be working on facial recognition. That should be something we abandon as a group, just because of the ways in which it can be terrible, not just against disabled people, but more generally.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So I wonder, I'm not gonna put this very well, but this about the intersection between disability narratives and narratives around sort of contemporary capital. Because I was just thinking that a lot of where that's going was this relentless pressure to optimize yourself, right? So, there was that book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, that basically says, you're a bad father if you just accept your pension, you're a good father if you invest lots of money in the stock market. Or the way just, Amazon relentlessly monitors their work. It's like, oh, that was 30 seconds you weren't working, we better dock your pay a little bit, right? So I wonder if there's about the intersection between two different narratives of optimizing people and sort of you're always supposed to be doing more. And I'm not sure where it goes from there, but
yeah, and we're all sort of sold this narrative, right? And it also leads to sort of this trope where, oh, you should be glad for what you have because disabled people don't have the same sort of functionality. And so it leads to, when I think about some of the memes there, but no, so this idea, and I think about Carl Elliott writing in the book Better Than Well, right? About American pharmaceuticals and American technology, and how this is a particular way of thinking about technology and bodies that's been exported all over the world, but is actually like a really weird strain of thought when you get down to it, that we're all supposed to be optimizing at all times. And it's a very individualistic way of thinking about human beings, right? That we are all our own projects. And we're not talking about building moral character, which might be an earlier sort of way of talking about this, because moral character has to do with internal things that people might not see. But a lot of the focus on, becoming better than well and optimizing ourselves is an individualist narrative about physical functioning and much less about moral functioning, but the physical becomes moral functioning in particular ways. I'm concerned about that in some of the work I do, and especially if we're all our own projects, then disability exists only in individuals and is not a community responsibility. I think about how that makes us build poor infrastructure, right? Because then you have to overcome to be able to, walk in public and use the sidewalk, right? And if you can't do it, then it's not because the sidewalk is broken, it's because your body isn't the right way. I think that there are these things in tension that you see echoed around particular projects. I think about how exoskeletons exist only for one person, and you better have like a lot of money to maintain it, right? It becomes sort of a capitalist dreamscape of transhumanism. Yeah. So there's a sentence I have written down, and I meant to read it, and I've written one good sentence since I started sabbatical, and this is it. So hold on to your hats, everyone. The sharper end of techno-ableism is that if one cannot measure up by technological means, and this gets to the individualized technological means, then there are technological eugenical means for dealing with the most unfortunate cases. Prosthetic legs, Prozac, pacemakers, ostomy bags, fidget spinners, heating pads, and wheelchairs are technology for disability just as much as gas chambers, institutional confinement, and prenatal deselection. That's it, my whole sabbatical. That's all I've gotten accomplished. It's, putting that idea, I've been thinking about what Joel Reynolds and Rosemary Garland Thompson have been talking about in this series too, right? The flip side of a lot of this is, especially if things are about individuals and making individuals measure up and be the best, then those that don't are discardable. Then those who will never, or we think will never, when we assume disability is always the big bad, their lives are cut off earlier. Or I think about all the people who aren't given supports that could let them flourish, right? We don't think that disabled people can have good lives in Aristotelian flourishing sense, not just, have good things, right? It sort of defaults us to always seeing disabled people as deficient. And if Prozac and prosthetic legs don't work, then institutional confinement and other means of silencing, separating, and discarding disabled people are the other option. So on that bummer, anyone else have a question?
I can always talk more. I wanted to, so exoskeletons strike me as the strangest idea in a way, right? So, because you have to do a lot of different things to get to the idea that you should have one, right? So first of all, walking has to be that without which life is not worth living or something, right? I mean, it has to be the absolute objective. And then you have to assume that this really elaborate apparatus is the best way to get there. So maybe I'd love to learn more about the military background here, because it's like it doesn't make sense without some other narrative to explain how we got to these things.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of exoskeleton funding is through the Department of Defense, right? And a lot of the people who they're trying out exoskeleton technologies on are people who have been disabled through military service. This is also how a lot of prosthetic limbs are developed. John Kinder has this book called Paying with Their Bodies, where it talks about like the justification for increased spending on amputees. Of course, after every major war since people survived amputations, right? Amputees have always existed, congenital amputees have always existed. However, we didn't exist in large enough numbers before the advent of like better surgeries, cleaning procedures, and the ability to like live through your amputation and not bleed out. And that was around the US Civil War. So you have this huge problem after the Civil War of all of these amputees that have very bad technology. You think about, I mean, the leg that I'm wearing now is based on the design that's post-Civil War. It's a hanger leg, right? I think about like every technology that amputees enjoy that's considered modern technology comes after and is justified through VA spending, through spending on vets, and it's thought that they've paid with their bodies, so they deserve this better technology. This gets into who deserves the technology and not, right? And the fact is a lot of veterans have a lot more access to technologies than other people do through various groups, not just charities, but also through the sort of insurance, but also they can test, especially more recent amputees can be part of testing programs that aren't really available to the wider amputee population. It also means that a lot of the things that are developed aren't good for all bodies. So when we think about who is in the military, who served, I mean, the BBC interview with the woman, oh, it's the first bionic limb designed for women. That's a big deal because a lot of prostheses, especially if we're talking like arm, those were modeled on men's bodies, right? Because they were tested in a VA setting. But the vast majority of amputees are not due to military service. The vast majority, sort of 55%, are due to peripheral artery disease and other complications from diabetes. And those complications and the sort of bodies that have those sorts of amputations are often not the military bodies where you have all that core strength. I think you hear of Hugh Hare's foot, the bionic one that gets all the press. He's been on the cover of like Popular Mechanics and things like that. Like, he has a computerized ankle that lets him like walk up steps, you know, really beautifully. But he was a world-class mountain climber before he became disabled and designed his own limb. He has a lot of core strength to carry a really heavy thing on one of the far sides of his limb, right? And not everyone has the strength to carry a heavy foot in order to walk smoothly. When I talked about it with my prosthetist, she said, you would walk worse if we got you one of those, because it's heavy, it's designed for men's bodies. And in fact, you can use a static ankle and you can wear it to the beach, and you can actually, you know, you could walk just as well as he does on that bionic thing. But you wouldn't walk on that bionic thing as well as he does. So I have a static ankle and it's great, you know, and it's a lot less tech, and I can get it wet. There are all these things, even though we think about his ankle is like the most advanced, and the sort of story about is it will just get better and better, right? He's reprogramming it all the time and wearing it on his body, and he's a disabled designer in this way, although I don't think he considers himself disabled any longer. The dream, we have this narrative about technology always progressing, but sometimes technologies are good enough, or people learn how to use them in different ways too. So there are these like intersecting narratives that I think about. One, from philosophy of technology, right? I think about all the narratives people have about the redemptive power of technologies. That narrative seems irresistible for everyone. But then we have all of these narratives that I've described to you about disabled bodies. But once you put these two sorts of narratives together, I mean, I think that's where we see a lot of terrible and ableist technological design. And even when the design goes well, like the way in which we talk about the design is actually still in an ableist vein. It's because we have these two trajectories, stories about technology and stories about disability, and neither of those stories is actually correct.
Does anybody else want to jump in before we wrap up here?
Oh,
yeah, sorry, Tyler.
Yeah, I have a question. Do you ever like identify like parallels between the critiques that disable give us towards society and like stoicism? Like, I don't know much about stoicism, but it seems like they would reject a lot of the attitudes like you identified as problematic. Or do any disabled people provide or draw from stoicism or anything like that?
I'm sure some of them do. I'm probably not the right person to answer that question. I know when I was diagnosed with cancer, and that's why I have a lot of my disabilities. And certainly I want a cure for cancer. I don't know that I care about a cure for my disabilities, right? Disambiguating those is important. I bought a couple of books about stoicism because how am I going to deal with like a terrible year, an emotional year? I have still not opened those books on stoicism. So yeah, it's not necessarily, even when I thought I would be drawing on it, something that I'm actively thinking about.
Thank you.
Thank you. If anyone else has any questions, I'll put my email in the chat. I'm happy to talk with anyone after the event if you don't feel like you want to voice your question here. or something you're thinking about. I am working on this book about techno-ableism, so I do appreciate feedback as well as questions. If there's just something you want to talk about with me too, I'd be interested.
Awesome.
Mine is a more general question. I just want to hear your thoughts on like sports performance technology and disabled persons in those arenas, and how they have used, I guess, like advancement to, I guess, like the debate on if it's fair or is it really sport, like is it really a sport, like, yeah, I just want to kind of hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, so I'm going to put her name in the chat. My friend Cora Olson does sports studies, and we actually talk about these things a lot together. So I thought a lot about sports technologies, and some of the ideas are really interesting, right? So the reason that wheelchair racing isn't with runners is that the wheelchair racers would smoke all the runners, right? It's not fair to the runners to put you in a division with wheelchair racers. I think about like potentialities of bodies. We always assume disabled bodies are deficient, but it doesn't work like that. And we always think things like the more disabled you are, and I put that in scare quotes, I'll explain what I mean in this case, that the more disabled you are, the less competitive you are. And my reply to that is often, so in the amputee world, the more leg, in the leg amputee world, the more leg you have, the better you're able to wear a prosthesis generally. Not always, depending on how you became an amputee, but in general, if you have a high above knee amputation, a hip disarticulation, those are really hard things to wear a prosthetic leg for. However, if you are someone who is engaging in amputee soccer, and and they use forearm crutches for that, the less leg you have, the better. Because you're lighter and quicker and you're more used to using crutches, and you can sort of crush people with more leg because they're less adept with the technology. You are so familiar with the technology in these cases of using forearm crutches, you can go really fast. Like people who use forearm crutches all the time, it's amazing to me the ways in which they can move sometimes. So I think a lot of our things when it comes to specific tasks, which sports asks us to do very, very specific things, a lot of our notions about disability to like become incoherent in sports arenas, right, are sort of, oh, the more you have, the better off you are. That doesn't work out in amputee soccer, because what we're looking for is a very specific skill set. And the skill set is, oh my God, you got to be good on crutches. Fun thing about amputee soccer is the goalie has to be an arm amputee and all the players have to be leg amputees. And if you're a bilateral amputee, you got to wear a prosthesis on one leg, but not the other, because you got to use the forearm crutches. So there's like interesting ways that you make things work out fairly for amputee soccer. And in fact, they're always looking for arm amputees for these teams because leg amputees outnumber arm amputees, A, and then B, arm amputees can play regular soccer. They're just not usually chosen as goalies, which is what they are in amputee soccer. There's also, I know there are lots of like conversations about fairness. The murderer, what's his name? Pistorius, Oscar Pistorius, hi. The murderer, Oscar Pistorius. Amputees are not fans of Oscar Pistorius now. He's the Blade Runner is what he was called in the 2000s, 90s, around that area, before he became a murderer. On his stand to testify about why he murdered his girlfriend by accident, he like made it seem as if he was more likely to kill someone because he was an amputee and on edge for that, which is why no one who is an amputee enjoys him anymore. Anyway, Oscar Pistorius, all the conversation was about like, he's going to beat non-disabled people. Like he could run faster than them. Like the worry was that because he was disabled, he could be better at this specific task. And that might be true. It's just not fair to put people with different functionalities in the same division, right? So there are different ways to make disability sports work out, but to suggest that he belonged, and the question was whether he should be in the Olympics rather than the Paralympics. And I remember like cartoons from the time, like it described like thanking him or praising him for his performance and the computer science team of whatever university, right? Because it was suggesting that his legs were mechanical in a, in a computerized way. They weren't. But the thing is, most people who would be participating in one of those running events who are amputees have a much lower body weight. And you know what you can do when you have a lower body weight is move more quickly, right? In fact, your meat appendages can slow you down in the case where you have replacement, such as a running blade. So they didn't put him into the Olympics, and it wouldn't have made any sense to put him into the Olympics because we're not even comparing the same thing, right? It's the same reason we don't put wheelchair racers and runners in the same competition. It wouldn't be fair, but it wouldn't be fair not in the way you would usually think. And that's not a problem. It just means that there are different divisions in sports. And a lot of our assumptions about disability as bad, as inferior, that disabled athletes can't measure up. I mean, people who are in the Paralympics are incredible athletes usually. But so much of it is about training in a specific niche. That's true for any athlete. I recommend Cora Olson's work. She's also been writing about Caster Semenya and gender testing. And I think a lot about disability and gender testing as different categories of looking out for fakers in ways that when you look at any evidence don't make sense. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Kennedy.
All right. So, anybody have any further thoughts or questions? If not, I think you should join me in thanking Ashley for her talk today. And I'd like to remind everyone that you don't have to quit seeing Ethics Center talks just because today's is over. There's one coming up on March 22nd about colonialism and citizen science. And then the final disability series speaker will be on April 15th. That's Kim Q Hall. So until then, thanks everybody.